You do need to read the syllabus, though. That is like so far you're one of your only 2 assignments, right? Read the syllabus. Make sure you ask me any questions if you have them. All right, so we are recording now. Now let me start the presentation. Fingers crossed that it works. I've been fighting with technology for a year now. Okay, so if you are online, you should be seeing my slideshow. Can one person confirm that for me verbally? Because I can't, I heard somebody typed, but I can't see it.
We can see it.
Perfect, thank you. All right. So we still, oh, it's 8 o'clock now. All right, so before we get started, I'll remind everybody, attendance for this class is email. So even if you're in person, make sure you email me every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday and say, let me know. Say, hey, I was in person and I sat in the front, you know, or hey, I attended online. Or even if you miss it and you plan on seeing it, like maybe you slept in and you're like, well, I'm writing for attendance. I missed the lecture, but I plan to watch it when you post the recording. You will be marked late for that, but you'll still get some points, and some points are better than no points. And you definitely don't want to lie about it, because occasionally I do go and check the videos to see see who was there, because it's recording. So that's how that works. Any questions about attendance? And again, to remind you, you have the option. You can obviously be in person or online. If you are one of the in-person people, I do recommend at least once, maybe twice, do go online and don't come in, because there might be a situation in which it has to be online, right? If I get exposed to COVID, I can't come in, right? And that happens a lot because I've got 3 kids. So just so you know how it works, you might at least want to do it once where you do the class online and get a feel for how it works. So any questions about that? All right, let's get started. We're actually going to get into biology now. We're done talking about the syllabus and things like that. So the first chapter we're going to talk about is called Learning About Life. And basically what this is a preview for what the entire semester is going to be. So let's jump into it. The beginning of each of your chapters has this thing called Why Biology Matters. And they've got little pictures on there. And if you read the textbook, you can see why that biology matters. And traditionally, I would take some time and kind of talk about this and have like a little guessing game. Like, what do you think this has to do with biology? But because of COVID and things being sort of more cramped as far as time is concerned, I'm skipping that. Obviously, nothing on there is going to be on the exam. Your book also starts off talking about why biology matters to you. And traditionally, that is something I talk about. But in this case, I think I'm just going to skip over it again. And yeah, you can read that. And there are a lot of different reasons biology might matter to you. But considering that we're in the middle of a pandemic, I think I don't need to necessarily tell you, hey, biology is important, right? Because we've got COVID-19. So it would help to know a little bit about biology, so you knew a little bit about viruses and vaccines, things like that. But yeah, read that if you want. It's not going to be a test question. I'm not going to ask you, why does biology matter to you? But yeah, it's something to think about. Also, that's a good idea for independent work. So if you want to write and say, I think biology will be relevant in my life because X, Y, and Z, right? And you could just write a few sentences. You can write a few pages, whatever you want. Just an idea for independent work. So the chapter itself is broken down into 3 main bullet points. First, we're going to talk about the scientific study of life. Then we're going to talk about the properties of life. And then finally, we'll talk about the major themes in biology. So the question is, that we start with, how do you define biology? So hopefully, well, I don't want to say that. Can anybody tell me what the definition of biology is? Either online or in person. Anybody want to take a guess? Yeah. Great. That's what I used to say too. That's what most people say. But technically, it's not necessarily just the study of life. It's a little bit more specific. Biology, according to this textbook, is the scientific study of life. And that is an important distinction because there are other ways of studying life, right? It's not all about science. And that just, the fact that it is about science, that's what makes it biology. And we're going to talk about that. So given that that's the definition, and you do need to know that for the exam, know that the biology is the scientific study of life. Given that, then you have to ask yourself, then what is a scientific study, right? What does it mean? What does science mean? And then also, if it's a scientific study of life, then what exactly is life? What does it mean to be alive? And like I said earlier, the reason we make this distinction between scientific study of life as opposed to just the study of life is because there are other ways to study life. And we'll discuss those briefly. All right. Actually, are there any questions so far before we move into this? Okay. All right. Scientific investigations are not the only ways of knowing nature or life. So what do you think? What are some other ways you could study life? Like, what if I said, what's the meaning of life? What kind of subject would that be, you think? Philosophy, yeah, or maybe religion. Or what if I said, what has happened in lives prior to us? History, right? Yeah, so there's all these different ways of studying life. Religion, history, philosophy, art, others. I don't know if you guys know. If you can think of something else, let me know. Also, another good independent work idea. If you want to write a little short paper, just write, here's all the other ways of studying life. Your book points out, and I'm glad your book does point this out because this is very important to me, that a broad education, like getting a bachelor's degree, that should include exposure to all these different ways of studying life. And again, like I said on Monday, and like I said when I re-recorded that video about the syllabus, my job here is to help you become critical thinkers. And really, that's what your job here is, getting a bachelor's degree, is becoming critical thinkers. Anyway, this is just kind of an intro. None of this is going to be on the exam either. So then if we talk about the fact that there's a scientific study of life and all these other different ways of studying life, then what is the difference? What's the difference between science and everything else? And that's what we'll get into. Your book defines science as an approach to understanding the natural world based on inquiry. So I guess you should know that for the exam. I can't guarantee that it'll be on there, but it might. You need to know the definition of science. And I'm usually not even big on definitions. I'm more of kind of person who wants to see if you can figure something out as opposed to just memorizing stuff. But occasionally you will need to memorize stuff, and that might be one of them. An approach to understanding nature or the natural world based on inquiry. In other words, science is basically trying to figure stuff out, right? By asking questions. You ask questions and then you try to answer them. That's basically what science is. Your book also says that science is a search for information, search for explanations, search for answers to specific questions. And again, as far as I'm concerned, the most important thing for the exam anyway is just this first bullet point right here. Science is the approach to understanding the natural world based on inquiry. That being said, we could talk briefly about what scientists do. They seek natural causes. So again, if we're trying to compare and contrast biology to other ways of understanding the world, if you're a religious scholar, perhaps, and you're trying to figure out, hey, why did this happen? You might say it was supernatural, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just not how scientists do it, right? It's two different ways of looking at the world. Scientists focus on processes and structures, and that's going to make a lot more sense as we go through the semester. You'll learn exactly what a process and structure is in the context of this class. These processes and structures have to be verifiably observed. They have to be measured or measurable. Oh, good. My thing's freezing up. There we go. Sorry, guys. So, any questions about this slide before we move forward? All right, nice and easy. Next thing we're going to do is jump into the scientific method. Now, that's exactly what this week's lab's about. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it yet, but I shared it on Google Classroom. And it's basically just going through the processes of the scientific method. It's a goldfish lab. And honestly, the goldfish part doesn't even matter because you don't need to know about goldfish for biology. What you need to understand is the scientific process. And that is what we are about to talk about. Science begins, aka the first step of the scientific process, is observation. So you definitely need to know that. There will be test questions in which I ask you to put the scientific method in order. And then there'll be other ones where I actually describe something. Like if you see something, what would that be? And that would be this, right? It's the first one, it's observations. And with observations, a scientist or even just a regular person will watch a subject, right? And they'll take data. A lot of times they record their observations, and this evidence, or the evidence is what scientific inquiry is all about, right? It's all about data. It's all about numbers, recorded observations. So that's step one. Again, step one is observation. And again, your book also says exploration / observation. So as far as we're concerned in this class for the exam, those two words are interchangeable. Step 1, exploration, AKA observation. There is a slight difference because, exploration is when somebody is specifically looking for stuff, right? Like if you explore, you're specifically looking for stuff. But sometimes it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes you're just out and about and you observe something. So does anybody know what comes after step 1? Any guess what might happen after you observe something? Yes. Close. Technically, that is after, yeah, but there's a step before that. It's a great guess. Sort of, yeah. Your book talks about Jane Goodall. Sorry, I should have put this up there earlier. She's a great example of somebody who's doing exploration, right? So she went out and observed chimpanzees for years. Anyway, I missed something. There we go. Sorry. Good grief. I'm out of it today. After exploration, so after step 1 comes step 2, which are questions. So after you observe something, because remember, science is all about inquiry, right? So you see something, and then that leads you to a question. So you see something, you wonder why this is that way. And then comes, like the gentleman said earlier, the hypothesis. And you need to know what a hypothesis is too. That is a proposed explanation for a set of observations. Hypotheses have to be testable and they have to be falsifiable. So for example, if you saw a big footprint in your backyard and your hypothesis was must have been Bigfoot, that is not a valid hypothesis because we can't really test that or make it, it's not falsifiable. You can prove it is true if you watched and watch and watch, and maybe eventually you did see a Bigfoot. But the fact that you can't prove a negative, so it's not a valid hypothesis. Yeah, and then after the hypothesis comes predictions. A lot of times people get these things confused and mixed up because the hypotheses do seem a lot like predictions. And they are related, but there's a subtle and important difference. So again, the hypothesis is it's an explanation, right? It's an explanation that you can test. Predictions are basically statements based on the hypothesis that you can test. So for example, in my environmental biology class, there's a lab where people do air quality tests, right? They want to see what the air quality is around the country. So the question is, there's a lot of different questions. Like, is the air quality better where you live or in LA? Is the air quality better where you live or in Denver? So on and so forth, a long list of cities. And the hypothesis would be simply that, like the air quality is better here or the air quality is better there. That's the hypothesis. But from that one hypothesis, you can have all these multiple predictions. And the predictions are basically verbally describing the way you're going to test your hypothesis. So for example, you could say, and then also it's usually an if-then statement. So you might say, if I look up the air quality, I will find that the air quality is better here than it is in Denver. That's one prediction, right? Or you could say, if somebody with asthma lives here versus if they live there, then they're probably going to be healthier. All these different ways of testing your hypotheses is what I'm getting at. And when you look at the lab, there's also some good examples of the difference and the relationship between hypotheses and predictions. So anyway, after the prediction comes the experiment when you actually do test your hypotheses. And that's basically what lab's all about this semester. And after the experiment, you could be done or you could test with some more observations. So are there any questions so far? All right, let's talk about testing these hypotheses, the experiment itself. Your big, I cannot talk today. This is mask. Your book gives a great example of the scientific process because this is a real life example. A lot of times people do the scientific process. They're just not thinking about it, right? You don't think, what is the scientific process? So obviously you can tell what that is, right? So let's assume you hit the power button on that remote and your TV doesn't come on, right? That is the observation. And what comes after the observation? I know I just told you, so it's hard to, I don't expect you to have it memorized yet, but question, good. In that case, if you hit the power button and it doesn't turn on, what would your question be? Yeah, why isn't it turning on? And what comes after the question? Good, a hypothesis. In this case, your book says that one of the hypotheses could be that the remote's batteries are dead. That's a logical conclusion, right? So for the prediction, again, like I said, it's usually an if-then statement or something along those lines. So it says, if I replace the battery, the remote will work, right? That's the prediction. So then the experiment would be just replacing the batteries. And here's where it gets a little bit weird. Because again, you do the experiment, you replace the batteries, and let's say your experiment supports your hypothesis. So you plug it in, you hit the power button, and your TV turns on. In real life, you're done, right? You're going to watch whatever show it is that you want to watch. But in science, what they get at here is if you do this experiment and it supports your hypothesis, then you actually go and you make new predictions and you test them. And again, that's really weird in this situation because you wouldn't do that in this situation. You would say, oh, that fixed my problem. I'm going to watch TV. But I'd give you an example for this one. So for my thesis as a graduate student, we were looking at genes for watermelon plants to see, does anybody know what trichomes are? Anyway, they're these little hairy, little fuzzy things on plants. And what we were looking at is to see what genes were responsible for making these plants fuzzy. And there was different ways we would do that. So the way I did it, everybody had their own experiment, was I looked at the RNA expression, and that's something we'll talk about later in the semester. And my prediction or my experiment did support that hypothesis. And then somebody else had an experiment where they actually cut the gene out of the plant and made new plants. And sure enough, those plants that used to be hairy were no longer hairy. So that prediction, that experiment also supported the hypothesis. Then someone else had one where they took a bald plant and inserted the gene into it that made it hairy, and sure enough, it made it hairy. Does that make sense? So in real life, in real science, generally speaking, if you have a hypothesis and you test it with your prediction and it supports your hypothesis, usually you're not done. Usually you've got to come up with all these different ways to test your hypothesis. Anyway, so any questions about that? Obviously, if you run your hypothesis, if you run your test, and it doesn't support your hypothesis, then you're back at you're going back to the drawing board, right? So if you replace the batteries, it doesn't work, you're like, okay, now what's the problem? And you go and make sure your TV's plugged in, right? Or maybe make sure your TV actually works or that your remote actually works. So anyway, for the exam, make sure you know this process. Exploration, hypothesis, prediction, experiment. That's the correct order, and you need to know that for the exam. And we'll talk about that just throughout the semester anyway. All right, I'm not reading this, but I put it on there, yes. Yeah. So the next slide I'm going to show you, that I just saw briefly, I gave, again, some examples of the relationship between hypotheses and predictions. But that's just up there for you to read because you have access to my PowerPoints on Google Classroom. So I'm not actually going to verbally read it to you because we've already had that discussion. So, and that's a lot, right? All right, the next portion of the scientific process is communication and outcomes. This one's a little bit less important for you as far as the exam is concerned. We're going to talk about it briefly. It is kind of important for your overall life, and you'll see why as we go through it. So before a study can be published in a scientific journal, the research has to be evaluated by qualified, impartial, and often anonymous experts who are not involved in the study. So I'm sure you guys have heard the word peer-reviewed, and this is what it means, and it is very important. And it's not perfect. Have you guys ever heard of the study where somebody said that vaccines cause autism? I don't know if you've heard about that one. It's a really old one. It was actually published in a peer-reviewed journal, but then somebody found out that the guy was lying about his studies, and it had to be retracted. The point is, yes, it's not perfect, but it's still better than just finding any old garbage on the internet because anybody can publish anything on the internet. I call this the misinformation age that we're living in because, in my opinion, I think if you have a hypothesis, I feel like you can test that with the internet and find any answer you want, right? There's a lot of crazy stuff out there. I could say, I don't know, ice cream causes malaria, and I could probably support that by crap I find on the internet, right? It's out there. So yeah, peer-reviewed journals, that's why they're so important. Yeah, any questions about that? So also throughout the semester, I'll give you some examples. I've got to get back on social media to do this, but especially right now, with all the political stuff going on and the COVID stuff going on, There's so much misinformation out there where people just share something like, did you even read this? This is ridiculous. Anyway, I'll give some examples. It'll be fun to look into. So a lot of scientific research is focused on actually solving problems. This is very, I don't want to say irrelevant. It's the opposite. It's actually very relevant right now, but we don't need to talk about it much because what do you think about what we're living through, right? So there's been a lot of scientific research for people to come up with these new vaccines for COVID, for example. So yeah, obviously there's an outcome for science. It's not like everybody's just doing science for the sake of science. Usually there's an outcome. All right, let's see here. Yeah, we've still got time, plenty of time. Let's discuss the relationship and the differences between hypotheses, theories, and facts. A lot of times these words are used interchangeably, but they're not. They're not interchangeable. Before we jump into that, does anybody have any questions for anything we've covered so far? All right. Can anybody take a guess at what a theory is? I don't expect anybody to know yet. I'm just curious if anybody knew. A lot here, right? A theory is a comprehensive, well-substantiated explanation that is broader in scope than a hypothesis. So I put that part in bold because as far as I'm concerned, when you're studying, that's what you should remember. A theory is broader in scope than a hypothesis. And a lot of times, like I said, people use the word theory when they mean hypothesis. Like if I ask my wife, why was our son being such a jerk today? She might say, well, my theory is he didn't get enough sleep last night. I might know that's your hypothesis. I would never correct her though. She'd be pretty pissed at me. A theory is only widely accepted if it's supported by a large, varied, and growing body of evidence. A theory is used to explain many observations, right, as opposed to a hypothesis, which is very specific and is an explanation for that one observation. Theories can explain many observations. And your one theory can kind of spring off. You could have many new ways of testing hypotheses. And I'll give you an example of that here in a couple slides. And like any other scientific idea, theories have to be refined or abandoned if new contradictory evidence is discovered. Like for example, we used to think everything revolved around the Earth, right? And then someone figured out that the Earth actually revolves around the sun, so on and so forth. As we learn new things, we have to change our theories. And again, for the exam, the most important thing on this slide is theories are more comprehensive, right? They're broader in scope than a hypothesis. So any questions on this slide before we move forward? And again, if you're a note taker, I don't know. Obviously, you're going to have access to these PowerPoints. They're already up there. And you're going to have access to the videos. So if I'm going too fast, I can slow down. Just let me know. But also keep that in mind as you have access to all this. All right. So here's a good example of the difference, the relationship between a theory and a hypothesis. So we have these two different hypotheses, one of which says long, thin roots are an adaptation that helps some plants survive in an urban habitat. And you can see that's a picture of right there, right? That plant is growing in between, looks like a brick wall and pavement, right? So having long, thin roots will help it live like that. Another completely separate hypothesis is that the unusual bone structure in a hummingbird's wings is an evolutionary adaptation that provides an advantage in gathering nectar from flowers, right? So those two things sound completely different. You're talking about plants and animals, right? Completely different things. However, in contrast, the following theory I'm about to tell you ties together these seemingly unrelated hypotheses. So the theory is, I heard a noise, I'll get with you in a second. The theory is adaptations to the local environment evolved by natural selection. So basically what we're saying is by the theory of natural selection, we can have all these different hypotheses. For the exam or for your note taking, there's nothing on here that's going to be on the exam. Those are just examples. This is a good example of how you can have one theory, and then from that theory, have all these multiple hypotheses. I can't see the screen for you people online, but I did hear a noise where it indicated someone either raised their hand or typed a question. So if you have a question, can you verbally say it? Because like I said, I can't read it if you typed it. Must not have been anything. Could have been a glitch. All right. If there's no questions, we'll move forward. How about you guys? Any questions? Okay. All right, let's talk about what a fact is. A fact is a piece of information that is considered objectively true based on all current evidence. So I could say fact, Los Agaves is 3.2 miles or however far away it is from here, right? That's a fact. What I can't say is fact, Los Agaves has the best margaritas in town, right? Because that's not objectively true. I might believe it, but that's subjective. It's not objective. So facts have to be objectively true. They have to be verified. And therefore, again, what's another thing that makes them different than opinions. So again, if I say fact, Los Agaves is 3.2 miles away, you could verify that, right? You could look on the map. You could actually drive it and use your odometer. A lot of people associate facts with science, which almost makes sense because we do deal with facts in science. But accumulating facts is not the primary goal of science. So in your book, your book used the example of a phone book. So a phone book is nothing but a bunch of facts, right? It's like fact, this person lives at this address and this is their phone number, right? Those are verifiable, those are facts. But those don't explain anything. And that's the difference between a fact and science. So yes, we use facts in science, but the goal of science is to answer questions, right? So just having a bunch of facts doesn't matter. And again, I'll use my thesis work as an example. I looked at all these different RNA expressions, right? So I can say fact, this gene was expressed this much. Fact, that gene was expressed that much, right? And that's just a bunch of facts. That in itself is useless. So I had to take that information and say, look, if you look at all these facts, that indicates that these genes are responsible for this. And again, that's the cornerstone of science, is trying to answer questions. So are there any questions so far? All right. Your book gives a great example of some famous scientists, Newton, Darwin, Einstein. They stand out in the history of science because their theories had broad power to explain things, right? Not just facts. That's just an example. That also will not be on the exam. And really, of those three scientists, the only ones we're going to talk about in this class are Darwin, or only one is Darwin. All right, so let's talk about experiments. Whew, it's a big one. To investigate hypothesis, a scientist, or you in this case, in labs, you will run multiple tests, many times with one factor changing and all other factors held constant. And before we talk about that, there's some vocabulary words you need to be familiar with. Variables, those are factors that change in an experiment. So I'll give you a kind of a gross example. Let's say prior to COVID, my friends used to come over and hang out, right? We'd hang out at the backfire, maybe have a couple of drinks. And my friends always peed in the same spot in my yard. So there's the observation, is my friends are peeing in the same spot in my yard and the grass seems to do better there, right? That's my observation. Question, is pee good for grass, right? Because I observed they're peeing there and that's what it seems like. So hypothesis in that case would be, yes, pee is good for grass. So then from there, we have the prediction, right? So I could say, and here's where it gets a little bit different. Here's where we talk about variables. So prediction one could be, if I have my friends stop peeing in that area, then the grass will stop looking as good, right? That's one way of testing it. That's one prediction. Another one could be, if I have them pee there more, then the grass will get even better, right? Or then I could actually do a real experiment where I took different plants and I did controlled experiments where I said, all right, this plant is going to get 100% water for 15 weeks. This plant is going to get 10% water and 90% urine for 10 weeks. You see what I'm saying? And that different varying amount of urine, I know that sounds gross, but hopefully that grossness will help you remember it, this example. Each one of them gets different amounts of urine, and that would be the variable, right? That's the factor that's changing. In a controlled experiment, or a controlled experiment is one that compares two or more groups that differ only in one variable that the experiment is designed to test. So again, that urine example I told you about, that would be a controlled experiment. The control group lacks or does not receive the specific factor being tested. So like I said, plant one would have received 100% water, right? That would be the control group in that experiment, because what I'm trying to see is if urine is good for plants. And then everything else would be the experimental group, right? The experimental group has or receives the specific factor being tested. So that's a lot of information. I apologize for that. I really hate PowerPoint slides that are thick with information like that, but sometimes it's necessary. Are there any questions about what's on this slide? So another idea for independent work, excuse me, and this is all a kind of a thought exercise, but if you can think of an experiment, well, first of all, you could do an experiment for the independent work, or if you want, you could just set up an experiment. You can say, all right, this is how I would do this experiment if I were to do it, right? You can just put it on paper. You can have your variables and your control group and your experimental group, and you can just write about it and not necessarily do it. Because it's a thought exercise. I want you to think scientifically. Yes? Yes, good question. So he asked about independent work. What I need you to do is turn it in using Google Docs. So if you, you're on Google Classroom, right? Okay, good. So today I'm going to post that video I made yesterday, where it's the syllabus video. But in that video, I also show you how to turn in independent work. So great question. You're going to go to Google Docs. It sounds complicated, but it's really not. When I show you, when you see the video, you'll see it's actually pretty easy. But that being said, you know, that's what I want from you guys. But if there's something weird, maybe you have computer problems and you're like, well, I really need to type it and print it and hand it in to you, I guess I would accept that. I prefer not to, but I'm flexible. So good question. Any other questions? Okay, let's talk more about these controlled experiments. When we're talking about variables, there's two different types of variables. There's the independent variable and the dependent variable. The independent variable is the variable whose change is not affected by any other variable in the experiment, versus the dependent variable, which is the thing that's actually being studied and measured in the experiment. And that the changes in the experiment, that's the change, right? That's what's getting changed as a result of the changes to the independent variable. So for example, in the urine experiment, the independent variable would be the percentage of urine that I'm giving each one of those plants, right? Like I said, that one's getting 0% urine. This one's getting 90% urine. This one's getting 80% urine. Like, I'm controlling that, right? That's the independent variable. And then we would measure it to see how tall it's getting, right? Which one grows the quickest? In that case, the height of the plant, you know, that we're measuring, that would be the dependent variable, because what we're saying is that the height is dependent on, you know, its health, how much, you know, urine it's getting. And again, I know it's a really gross, weird example, but I'm doing that on purpose because I want that to stick in your head. So these two bullet points, that's how your book describes the difference between independent and dependent variable. Another way that you could describe it is the independent variable is the cause or the thing that you change, and the dependent variable is the effect or the thing that changed because of the experiment. And your book does point out that a well-designed experiment often tests just one independent variable at a time. So, any questions about this slide? All right, moving forward. Yeah, just some words you should know. Medical drug trials can include something called a placebo. And hopefully you guys know what a placebo is, because if you're watching any kind of news, hopefully you've heard of it. But can anybody tell me what a placebo is? That's all right, I can tell you. It is a medically ineffective treatment. So, for example, the people that were getting tested with the vaccine before it was put out there, some people went in, everybody got shots. However, only some of them got the real vaccine, other people got saline. And neither one of them knew which one it was. So if you were getting the real thing or the placebo, you didn't know. It allows the placebo group to serve as a control group. Typically, the placebo group doesn't know they're receiving it, like I said. And then there's also something called a double-blind experiment, which is what I think was what they used for these vaccine trials. That's what the participant doesn't know, and neither does the scientist, right? So the person giving you the shot, they don't know if it was a placebo or vaccine either. For the exam, basically just know that the placebo is just the ineffective treatment. And the double-blind experiment is when nobody involved even knows who's who, basically. So any questions about a placebo or double-blind experiments? All right. So, and again, you know, you would want to do that because, again, if you give everybody, 1,000 people these shots and, 500 of them were the vaccine and 500 of them were the actual vaccine, 500 placebo, 500 vaccine. If you did that and found out that 50% of people who got the vaccine didn't get COVID, but then also found out that 50% of the people who got the placebo also didn't get COVID, then you'd have to wonder, all right, maybe it's not the vaccine. Maybe there's something else going on because, again, you had the same results with the placebo. And that's what the purpose of a placebo is. Okay. Every chapter has this thing here called the process of science, where they kind of give you an experiment, a real life experiment that somebody's done. And I'm going to skip those. I'm never going to test you on it. But as you're going through your test book, I do recommend reading it because, again, it'll help you think scientifically. But we're just a little bit short on time, so I'm going to skip them. All right, let's talk about evaluating scientific claims. And then I think that'd be a good place to end for the day after that. All right, this is a good one that your book talks about. And man, what a relevant time to have this discussion. Pseudoscience. That is a field of study that's falsely presented as having scientific basis. There's a lot of pseudoscience out there right now. And a lot of people have done a really good job of making it look real. Or, I mean, that's the book definition. And in my opinion, pseudoscience can be more than that. In my opinion, pseudoscience could also be people lying to you, using real science, but lying to you about it. For example, there was a PDF floating around about the vaccine, and it said, the people sharing it said something like, you can't have sex for 28 days if you have the vaccine. And it did say that. It said right there when you looked, it said, look at page 127 of this PDF. And sure enough, if you go to page 127, it says something about not having uncontrolled or not having sex or having like regulations on how you had to have sex. And again, like I said, that was a real PDF and it really was there on page 127. But if you're a critical thinker and you read the whole thing, at the very beginning at page 1, it says, this is not like what happens when you take the vaccine. Those were instructions on how the people should have done the vaccine test. So that was from months ago when they were doing the test. Those are just the instructions on how to do the experiment. So anyway, pseudoscience, very dangerous. There's several indicators of pseudoscience. You should know these. First of all, anecdotal evidence, which is based on a single or a few examples and don't support a generalized conclusion. Anecdotal evidence is very powerful too. For example, I think one person, let's say you knew somebody, I don't know, you're taking multiple vitamins, right? Multivitamins. Everyone's taking this one brand of multivitamins. And you know somebody who took it and died, right? They took the multivitamins and it killed them. And then let's say that's the only person out of the millions of people that are taking the multivitamin that died. In your mind, that's a dangerous multivitamin, right? Because that's anecdotal and you know that person. It's like you just know somebody who died. That's really strong evidence. And sometimes it's hard to get past that, right? Your brain can say, look, I see the numbers, only 1 out of millions of people died. Sometimes that anecdotal evidence can be stronger because it's more emotional than logical. So it can be hard to overcome that. The source of information is also a good indicator of whether or not it's pseudoscience. So for example, is it peer reviewed, right? Or is it just something that Karen on the internet typed up about GMOs? No offense if any of you are Karen. Is it from a company trying to sell you something? So, man, I wish I could remember this example. I saw something do you guys know what the Impossible Burger is or the Impossible Whopper, whatever? It's the meatless Whopper. I remember when it came out, somebody put out something, I don't remember what it was. It's basically how it's bad for you, how the meatless burgers can be bad for you. And I wish I could remember how. But as I read it, and then I read who wrote it, it was a veterinarian, not just any old veterinarian, right? Not the guy working on your cats and dogs, but he was a cattle veterinarian. So if people stop eating burgers, then he's out of a job. So again, look at the source. Is he trying to sell you something? Yeah. Or, there's a lot of misinformation about GMOs, for example, in organic food. And you have to look at the source. Usually, they'll say, oh, it's big pharma. it's big agriculture. And yeah, people who are trying to say that to you are also the people trying to sell you that they're organic food, right? So yeah, they're saying this is bad because they've got the alternative. Like, you think that's bad? Have some of my organic cabbage. Any questions about this before we move forward? For the exam, I would say the most important thing on this slide is you need to know what pseudoscience is in general, and you need to know what anecdotal evidence is. Other than that, this information is pretty much just for you. Well, that's another thing you can do for independent work. If you're on social media and you happen to run across something and you say, this looks a little bit fishy, look into it. You know, say, I saw this, I looked into it, and I found out it was pseudoscience, and just share that with me. All right, there's basically everything that we talked about in a little chart for you. You can read it. I'm not going to ask you anything about it. It's kind of comparing and contrasting science and pseudoscience. And when we're talking about the source of the information, obviously, too, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but you should read it. It's like a little checklist. Oh, yeah, this is another good one. Is the information current? You'll see a lot of that, where somebody will share some scientific study from 2012, and maybe at the time, the information contained in that study was accurate. But again, as I said earlier, as science goes on, as we learn new things, sometimes we have to abandon old theories and old hypotheses. Is the source primary and not secondary? That is a real big one. Does anybody know the difference between that? That's okay.
Primary is something. A main source.
Yeah, the main source. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go throughout the course. There's a lot of things, most things, in my opinion, for casual reading, are not primary sources. So you'll see this article in just some regular old newspaper that said, hey, you know, we looked at this study and it turns out that if you drink this kind of milk, it makes you go a third nipple or something, whatever. Yeah, so that would be the secondary source, is the article. So yeah, if we're talking about like journalism, a primary source would be like somebody who saw it firsthand. So for science, it's like, again, a secondary source would be like an article that you read, like an easy to read article where they say, hey, this study proves this. But you need to actually go to the primary source, especially these days, because people will often, either on purpose or on accident, they'll write this whole story about a primary, you know, this study and say, this is what they found. And a lot of times I've noticed people just completely screw it up. I'm like, no, that's not what the study found. You misread it. So look into that. I'll share some videos with you about it. Is the author identifiable and well qualified? That's really important, especially right now. There's a lot of misinformation going out there. And a lot of times the information is not, or the author is not even identifiable. We don't even know who started the rumor, much less well qualified. Does the author lack potential conflicts of interest? So again, like I was saying, that veterinarian who's saying that meatless burgers are bad. Yeah, that's a conflict of interest because he needs cows because that's his job. Are references cited? That's an important one. Are experiments described in enough detail that they can be reproduced? Was the information peer reviewed? We've already discussed that. Is the information unbiased? And finally, is the intent of the source known and valid? So this is just a checklist. This is for your information. I'm certainly not going to ask you to list all those things off on the exam. That's just for your own information. Any questions about that? All right. Then that's a good, 8 minutes. Yeah, we'll quit there. So when we get back, we'll hopefully finish up chapter 1 on Friday. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
What do we actually have?
So for those of you online, he's asking about the lab. Are you on Google Classroom? Okay. So I shared a lab on Google Classroom, and if you click on the document and all the different links, it'll actually walk you through it. However, I will be online Wednesday or today. What is it, from 2 to 4:20? Whatever the time is, I'll be online so you can reach me. So when you go to do the lab, if it should be self-explanatory, but if it's not, I'll be there and we can work on it together. Yeah, and that's all I have. Make sure everybody emails me for attendance. I guess that's it. I'll see you all at lab if you want to be there today. Otherwise, I'll see you on Friday.
Fish's mouth is hard to count.
What's that?
Fish's mouth is hard to count.
Oh, yes.
guys have a good one.
All right, you too.